Our thinking in the early days when we took the business over was the church field, which he had been working with largely, hotels, and theaters. We didn't realize that the large movie theaters were coming. And he had a contract with the Hotel Statler, which is now the Hotel Buffalo. And of course, the company having gone into receivership, it was necessary to renew that contract, and I went down to see Mr. Statler with Mr. Hope Jones, and we did get the contract. It was a most peculiar installation. Mr. Statler had just built an addition to his hotel, and he had a large banquet room in the new addition that was on the second floor. His grill room, really the dining room that was used mostly by him, the problem was that he wanted the music to be heard both in the banquet room on the second floor and to come through to the dining room on the ground floor, which had a glass dome roof over it. So we installed the organ in 2 bedrooms that were there, and a peculiar result occurred. When we played full organ, it was softer than when we played individual stops. We realized then that we were just encountering what is well known in physics. The sound waves were melting together. Although this was a narrow hall that we had the tone come out into, the tone chambers were on either side. We built a thin wall. I don't think it was over 1.5 inches thick, the full length of the hall. From then on, the results were fine because the sound waves couldn't mingle anymore. Later on, when Mr. Statler built his new hotel, we sold him 2 organs, one for the main dining room and one for the ballroom. We tried many things to develop the business. We were new at it. This was a new field. No one had ever built organs for theaters before. We got an order from the Court Theater in New York and also from the Court Theater in Chicago and installed those, replacing the orchestras. Just at that particular time, there had been a year's strike of the musicians in New York, and that made it easier for us to enter the theater field. They made it possible. Well, one of our early installations was in the theater that most of you have never heard of, the Century Theater on Central Park West. It was built by a group of very wealthy men because they wanted to do something outstanding for the theater world. And they only had spectacular shows. The one that was on, I remember quite distinctly, when we installed our organ without expense to the theater. It was called The Daughter of the Gods. Oscar Hammerstein had written the music for it, and he was there. So we put this fairly large instrument in there, and it was demonstrated. It wasn't long after that the Criterion Theater, which the name was changed to the Vitagraph Theater, put on the first long film show in the history of moving pictures. It lasted an hour, and I believe it was called America. Our organ was the only music that was used, and that was a really historical event in motion picture history. I recall when we used the diaphone pipes, which most of you know were used to imitate thunder and did, but the city authorities in New York forbade the use of them because they were afraid the plaster ceiling would come down, which it might have. This, of course, was not a movie house built for the purpose. It was an old theater changed over on 43rd and Broadway. That was the first and earliest installation of an organ where a long film was used. But to go back a little bit, Hope Jones obtained some contracts for organs for churches, and he'd come to me and he'd say, you know, this is really an important installation. If we could just add this stop and that stop to it, it would make it perfect. and it would mean so much to us in getting other contracts. Well, we were willing to go along with things like that, and we did. But at the end of 2 years, we had lost $200,000 in the Hope Jones organ department. Now, he was a very fine man in many, many respects, a real inventor and a gifted man. He was very persuasive. He could talk you into believing that black was white, and I think he succeeded sometimes. Well, at the end of this period of time, we decided that the only way we could make a success of the business was to have Hope Jones stay out of the factory and have nothing to do with the actual manufacturing operations. And we talked to him and also wrote him a letter, told him that he no longer had permission to come into the plant, that we would continue to pay him just as the contract provided for, and he had a percentage of the sales price on all the organs that we sold. And we told him that as soon as the business was profitable, that we would then establish an experimental shop for him where he could do the experimental work, but would not interfere with the current work going through, because you just cannot manufacture and make every instrument different than the last one that you built. And that, unfortunately, with his inventive mind, was the only way that he could manage it. So that discouraged Hope Jones that he could no longer come into the plant. It discouraged him that he no longer was in the public eye as much as he had been before. And as many of you know, he committed suicide on September 13, 1914. It was a great pity. Had he believed in us, he would have been well compensated, because a little later on, the business grew prosperous. His wife was, in my opinion, a very wonderful woman, very kind, and she did so much for all of the employees that she had known for years. Most of these people had come over from England with Hope Jones. We had many problems, many serious problems in those early days, because the loss that we had was a big one for us. But throughout it all, we never lost faith in what the Hope Jones organ was and what he had done. We believed in his work, and we believed that we could be a success in it, and we were.